What are some of the mistakes that the Pac-12 made that might be showing a little bit of a future for the Big 12 and what all of that means going forward?
You are Locked On Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats. I am your host, Mike Luke. Thanks for making this your first listen of the day. This show is brought to you by FanDuel. Check it out. All kinds of good stuff at FanDuel where you know your money's good. You can bet on stuff, and you know at the end of the day that it will be a fun experience. Check it out, FanDuel. All right, now, we're going to have one more day where we're talking about some conference realignment because this news is fascinating and there's always all kinds of moving parts to it. So but I think it's also indicative to be able to go back and look at where we were at this time last year, because at this time last year, we were somewhat in a similar situation. Now, there are some differences which we are going to lay out, but at this time last year, listen, all you heard about was from people like John Canzano and John Wilner were a great media deal is right around the corner. No, you know that there's all kinds of great things. We can't really get into the details, but all of the sources, all of the people that were in line were ready to go. We're ready to sign that deal at a moment's notice. Well, that was obviously all crap. And I knew it was all crap because I had a really good source on this one that was telling me that no, Arizona's going to end up in the Big 12 one way or the other. That's just the way it is because the money is not there. The chance that the Pac-12 had, there was one chance that the Pac-12 had to stay, and we are going to get into that in a second. But first of all, when it comes to national reporters, a lot of times these guys have no clue, or they are feeding a bias. And Wilner and Canzano were certainly showing that. They clearly didn't have any really good information, and it showed. Again, at the end of the day, Canzano was saying nobody was going to leave from the Pac-12, time to move on, fake news, all of that. Well, you know what? He obviously was being fed a spoonful of garbage. So now, what were some of the mistakes along the way, and where did people kind of come off wrong on this? Well, there's a couple different ones. First, a big mistake by the Pac-12 was overvaluing their product. The people in the Pac-12 clearly thought that their product was much, much more enviable than it actually was, and that people really wanted this product. And when they had a chance to be able to sign that that ESPN deal, they decided not to. And that was something that came back and actually, obviously bit them in the butt. Meanwhile, Brett Yormark, the sly one, said, all right, well, you don't want to sign that deal? Guess what? Watch this. I'm going to sign that deal. And the whole thing was about being able to get something in, to be able to just get that stability factor down. And he was very smart in how he did it as well, in that he knew that he needed to be able to make a move where if he was going to bring in other schools, there was going to be a stable factor. And he knew that there was going to be a linear component. Again, everybody knows that streaming is the wave of the future. But just because something is the wave of the future doesn't mean that the future is totally now. And I don't know that anybody was really looking to go into straight streaming at this point. I mean, heck, you look at the Big Ten, you look at the SEC, they were not interested in going straight streaming at that point, because there's still way too much uncharted waters out there, and it didn't really make a ton of sense. So Brett Yormark said, guess what? We're going to hop to the front of the line here. We are going to get that. And he gave himself flexibility on the back end. That was the other part I think that was incredibly smart about all of this, is giving himself that flexibility to be able to say, all right, we've got these schools right now, and we've got the potential to offer these corner four schools a new contract if the Pac-12 does go kaput. And guess what? The Pac-12 went kaput, and they were right there. But the first thing is you've got to be able to go for the instant. You've got to be able to go for the spot where you can instantly be in a spot where you know that, all right, we're good here. We know what we're doing, and we know that we are in a good spot because we have 4 or 5 years of a TV deal. Whereas the Pac-12, I think, thought that there was going to be other kinds of deals that came, and I think they grossly overestimated what Apple was going to do. Now, listen, this stage in the game, entities like Apple, they did not become billionaires by just throwing away money nonstop, throwing away money willy-nilly. That is not how you get rich. And Apple certainly did not, like I said, get rich doing that. And why would they overbid for a product that was boxed into a corner? Again, it was a comedy of errors. And also, it was going to be 100% streaming. Nobody was going for that. And they were going to lowball you as well at $24 million, whatever the case may be. Now, the other issue as well is that so many of these schools were like, well, yeah, I guess that's a cool idea, but at the same time, will that really work? Will that really work for us? And I don't think that that's really the case. I don't think that it really was the case that was ever going to work for them. And because $24 million just isn't enough, especially when you're going into a conference where you don't, or you're staying in a conference where, the visibility isn't great. And let's be honest here. The promises about things right around the corner, that was another thing where the Pac-12 screwed this up mightily. When the Pac-12 media deal was signed, all the member schools were told by Larry Scott, don't worry, you might take a little bit of a loss now, but don't worry, you're going to get that money back on the back end, and that never occurred. So when they tried selling the Pac-12 media deal, and they said, well, don't worry, you're going to get your money on the back end. Hard to believe. That never occurred. It never occurred. And so that was not going to be something that I think a lot of people were going to feel good about with Apple. And there was also just all these schools were waiting to bounce. There was just going to be something that made the dam break. And first it was Colorado. Obviously, they were like, all right, well, see you later. And Colorado literally left like right after media day. So you knew that. And then, everybody talks about, everybody talks about Washington and Oregon leaving to the Big Ten and the dominoes that fell. But you also got to remember that the night before, Arizona had already applied for admission into the Big 12, and that was granted. So Arizona was certainly moving. Now, listen, places like Utah and ASU, they didn't want to leave, but they never wanted to leave. And, when you got somebody like Michael Crow who doesn't care about sports, that's always going to be a little bit of a big factor there. But Yormark knew all of this, and, was basically just because you don't want to join doesn't mean that at some point you're not going to have to join. And that's where he was incredibly smart about all of this. And this is where he's incredibly smart, too, when it comes to the ACC. When it comes to the ACC, he knows that bottom line, he wants these schools in there, obviously. And even though they don't want to be, he's going to be very creative when it comes to exploring other ways to be able to make this happen. And I think that that's something that we should certainly keep a very, very close eye on. Now, we're going to talk about the arrogance too. And I think some of the arrogance might be a little bit of a bleed over too that we could talk about with the Big 12 or with some of the ACC schools. But first, FanDuel, my friends, check it out. FanDuel, all kinds of great stuff at FanDuel. FanDuel.com is your one-stop shop. Now, listen, you can bet on anything going on from WNBA, which I don't watch, or you can watch baseball, which I don't watch. But if I got a little bit of money in the game, a little bit of cash, guess what? FanDuel.com is where I'm going to do it. It is, like I said, it is a fun time. All kinds of good vibes from the folks at FanDuel.com. Check it out. Again, this is another one of these ones where you will thank me later on it because FanDuel.com is fun, and it is there is nothing more enjoyable than betting on something with your buddies and looking at it and saying, all right, well, where's this going to go? Who can make more money out of this? And your money is good. You're not having to deal with some guy in a back alley that you have to meet at like 3:00. FanDuel.com has you covered. Check it out. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit of the arrogance that led to all of this. This is something else that I think we need to keep in mind. Listen, the Pac-12 drastically overinflated their brand and what they thought that they were really worth. That's just a fact. And with the, and you had a lot of schools that I think were kind of looked down upon the Big 12, those unwashed masses over there. They're not AAU accredited. And again, I'm going to keep making this point. I made this point a billion times. I'm going to make this point again. I graduated from the U of A. My mother graduated from the U of A. My father graduated from the U of A. My sister graduated from the U of A. If my dog could graduate from the U of A, he would have graduated too. Guess what? My education is not viewed any differently if it is in the Big 12 or it is in the Pac-12 or the AAU accreditation being able to, be judged by the company you kept. Stanford is Stanford, Arizona is Arizona. There's nothing wrong with Arizona. It just is what it is. But I think you had so many of these schools that are like, oh, I would never go to a conference where you could get these people that aren't AAU accredited. Well, guess what? Neither is Oregon State, neither is Washington State, and ASU wasn't until like a couple years ago. So, spare me with all that nonsense and thinking that your brand, because when people watch sports, guess what? They don't care who's AAU accredited or not. That makes no difference to them. And that's why I think it's very smart by someone like a Brett Yormark to basically say, shoo, with all that nonsense. Poppycock. And he doesn't really care about the AAU aspect to it. And I think that is very, very smart. But the Pac-12 certainly did care about that. And that's also where they overvalued their brand. Their arrogance, again, was their undoing. And that is something that I think you could possibly be seeing with the Big 12 as well, the ACC. It's not the AAU accreditation because these schools aren't AAU accredited. But the one thing about them is you do know that I think some of them feel that they're a little bit above the Big 12. But guess what? You're worth what you're valued at. You're worth what you can get paid. It's kind of one of those things when people talk about, oh, well, this souvenir, it says in a magazine that it's worth, $1,300. Cool. But at the same time, just because it's worth $1,300 doesn't mean anything unless you're able to get somebody to pay you $1,300 for it. And that's where the Pac-12 is like, well, we've done internal values on and our brands are better. Well, obviously they weren't because nobody was really signing up for them. And the Big 12 had a few trump cards over them that did not have had a few trump cards over the over the Pac-12 that they couldn't have seen coming. First of all, you have far more fan base support. There's all kinds of schools that don't care about athletics in the Pac-12, whether that's Stanford, whether that is California. Heck, ASU. There's not a lot of support, and you can just tell that by the attendance numbers at a lot of these games where people just don't really care. In the Big 12, that is not the case. Everywhere you go in the Big 12, you are going to be playing against highly rated. You're going to be playing against hostile environments, places where people go to watch sports and where they like sports. And that is something that you don't really get a lot at some of the Pac-12 schools. Now, I think some of the Pac-12 schools, obviously, a little bit of that is their own arrogance, their own ignorance as well, because like I said, I don't know what's happened with Cal, but Cal doesn't care about sports anymore. And neither does Stanford. The point that I think with Stanford that really proves that point is you kept Jared Haas there for 8 years. I don't know that Jared Haas ever had a winning record. And if he did, it was like 17-15. You just kept him there just to keep him there when you could have hired somebody like a Mark Madsen, whoever the case may be. Granted, I know that he went to Cal, but my point still stands. But overall, though, there was a ton of arrogance. Meanwhile, Brett Yormark is laying in the wait, just saying, all right, well, when all of this breaks, I'm not going to force anything, but when all of this breaks, I am going to be ready to take on these 4 schools. And that is exactly what he did. So when the dam broke, and this was all about to go down, you knew that, all right, well, here we go. And here we went here we went and we were off. That's where that's what happened. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Arizona leave. Then essentially everybody is out the door. I do feel bad for our friends at Oregon State. I've really grown to like that fan base. I would love to see them get in the Big 12, but that's obviously another case for another time. But either way, the point stands, though, that when the chips were down and everybody was fleeing, the Big 12 was ready. Now I think you're seeing a little bit of some of the same thing when it comes to the Big 12 and the ACC, because there are all kinds of signs that this dam is going to break at some point. Listen, Florida State is suing to get out of its media rights deal, and a lot of people think that they are going to be able to win that lawsuit. If they win that lawsuit, I think it's kind of game on at that point, because I think a lot of different teams will be fleeing. I think Duke ends up in the Big 10. Wouldn't surprise me at all if North Carolina does as well, something like that. But and then you're also looking around. It doesn't sound like the SEC is looking to invite Florida State or Clemson for a couple different reasons. Now, they're not nearly as big on AAU accreditation in the SEC. They showed that obviously with adding Oklahoma. But Florida State and Clemson, it just makes, why would you, if you're already the premier football conference in the country and we're still at a 14-team playoff, why would you bring in a team that could take one of those spots from you that hasn't actually necessarily been that helpful for you, and you've taken some shots at, like a Florida State? I mean, Florida State under Mike Norvell now is a problem again. With Clemson, obviously, they've taken a little bit of a step back, but under Dabo Swinney, that Clemson is a problem. So you've got to factor all of that in when it comes to, do you really want to add this team? Do you really want to give a lifeline? Because it could take away a spot from LSU or one of those charter institutions. I'm not sure that you want to do that if you're the Big 12. And I'm also not sure that you want to send them that lifeline, because this hasn't really been these entities that have probably, in your opinion, dealt with you in good faith. And again, at SEC Media Day, they were taking all kinds of shots at Florida State, Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner. But this is all great. This is all great, great news for Brett Yormark, and we're going to explain why next. Thanks for keeping it Locked On Wildcats, and making this your first listen of the day. I am your host, Mike Luke. All right, now, Brett Yormark is saying, man, this looks pretty familiar to this time last year where, you got schools that are saying they don't necessarily want to join the Big 12, but they might not have a lot of options. We laid out the reasons for why there wouldn't necessarily be a ton of options for some of these schools, and by some fairly credible accounts, ESPN has told the ACC that if they lose 2 of the 7 schools from North Carolina, Duke, Florida State, Clemson, and there's a few other, Louisville, that TV deal would be null and void. And at that point, the ACC is toast. And I think everybody starts doing what's best for themselves. Like I said, you could see North Carolina end up in the ACC or SEC, although I still think at the end of the day, I have a hard time believing that Duke and North Carolina don't end up in the same conference for obvious reasons. But if that happens, everybody's going to be fleeing for security. And the SEC or the Big Ten, that's not an option for Florida State or Clemson. They're not going to take in those schools because of their academic institutions. So you basically have the SEC. And if the SEC doesn't take you, then the Big 12 is really your only other option. I think where Yormark is also smart, though, is that he is exploring private equity. And with private equity, that could change a lot of these scenarios because, listen, Clemson, Florida State, they're going to want a little bit more money to come into the Big 12, and I get it. Makes a lot of sense. I'd want more money too. But then the TV deal that you have right now. Now, what you have to do with the private equity aspect is you can say, listen, we can use some of this private equity and we can make this occur, in a much more feasible way, in that, yes, you're going to get some private equity. Maybe we pass it around to some of the other schools as well in the Big 12, but nobody's going to be getting less money. And I think that's where the entire thing is fascinating. Nobody will be getting less money. And I think you got to feel good about that possibility. And it's on Brett Yormark to be able to massage some of those egos, which I think that he can do. But again, if you're Florida State, if you're Clemson, and you're looking for stability, and because that's what this is. All of this is just a game plan for stability for the next round of negotiations. You need to be in one of those three conferences, and I think there's a good chance that the Big 12 will be powerful enough at that point that they're going to have a seat at any table. And that, again, that's kudos to Brett Yormark and what he's been able to do. But that's kind of how I see this one playing out. We've been down this road before. We've seen a track record where you get schools that overvalue themselves or think that they're beneath something, and lo and behold, they aren't beneath it, and they need to be able to come out and be kind of that school that is at the stage where you're ready to go. You're ready to rock and roll. We'll find out. But like I said, you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And there's a lot of similarities at this stage, which we will still be explaining a little bit later. Now, we're going to get into a lot more Arizona sports this week, but with all the conference realignment, thought that it was very necessary to continue to talk about this, because this has a great impact on the University of Arizona as well. So we're going to start talking about Arizona football strengths, what they, kind of what their trump cards are going into Big 12 play, where exactly we see everything playing out. Because, again, there's a lot to like about Arizona. There's a lot to like about where they kind of stand with everything. And I believe, and we talked about it, I believe that they are underrated. I believe that Arizona should be rated higher than they are. I think that you're probably going to see them ranked around 25, something like that. Arizona, to me, is better than that. I believe that Arizona is actually significantly better than that. And I think we're going to find out after the first month that Arizona should probably be ranked higher than that. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we start talking some college football playoffs, because I think they have the personnel. I think they have the players. And keep in mind, you've got the transfer portal open again. You got the transfer portal where that when that opens up, you can get some more players. And we've talked about some of Arizona's weaknesses, and there are certainly some, because, again, this isn't Georgia. This isn't something where you just replace one first-round pick with another. You got to continue to find those guys. And like I said, we've talked about that with the offensive tackle. We talked about that with, replacing Jordan Morgan. You don't necessarily just replace Jordan Morgan, but you got to find somebody that is good enough to be able to at least, take that first step. So that's the kind of stuff that we are looking at, though, when it comes to the pact, or when it comes to Arizona, the Arizona football team. Keep in mind, you got that really tough 2-game stretch to start the season, where you got almost at Florida State and Clemson, where you've got at Kansas State, then at Utah, and we're going to know a lot more about them at that point. And then we're going to get into some Arizona basketball as well. Tommy Lloyd, obviously the toast of Tucson. But on that note, thanks for listening to Locked On Wildcats and making this your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Mike Luke. We will be back with you tomorrow. Bear down and back the A. All right, sweet Dallas, you want to go out again? Maybe why don't we give him a little bit of food? I'll take him out. Give him food? Yeah. He's hoovering right now. He's definitely hungry. I'll take him out. How should I do this? Huh? How should I do it? Just put some pumpkin in here with the food? Yeah.
Yeah, don't give him a lot. Pumpkin's in the fridge. In that bowl. And that coffee cup up on the top there, I think it's got some food in it, so you can just give him. See the coffee cup up there?
Yeah.
It's got some,
This has got still some food in
a
the.
few little kernels in
This has
it.
got some food in
Give
the
him-
cup still. Want some food?
Just give him about a third of a cup of the food.